Good evening, everybody. My name is Mailika Mollagee. As stated in my bio, I was considered as a high-risk patient during my pregnancy. Before I get to that, I'd just like to say that I come from a large family, a fairly large family. My son is the 22nd grandchild of 23, and there's a great-grandchild also. And with that, I was exposed to several, to say the least, several births in the family. My sister being the largest contributor, she had 9 pregnancies. All the women in my family had had very, very different birthing choices. My sister, for example, had 9 C-sections, which actually went against the norm of even, I think, what most national hospitals would allow. And so with that sort of background, I was exposed to, as I said, very, very different ideas and thoughts on pregnancies and on births. I found out I was pregnant when I was in the UK on a break from my marriage. I was there during the month of June, just the start of our fasting period. And obviously, for pregnant women, Muslim women, we don't fast. But I participated in most of the spiritual activities besides fasting. So the start of my pregnancy, despite the slightly emotional distress of my marriage, I was deeply engrossed in other spiritual activities. I spent about 3 months in the UK before returning to South Africa. And shortly after that, I was divorced. So the pregnancy itself was quite tumultuous, very emotional, but physically, amazingly, it was the most beautiful experience I've ever had to endure. And I think through that, it was clear to me very early on that there was a higher power watching over us. Forgive me if I break down, if I shed it here. It's always a very emotional story. So that's my son crying. I was in Joburg at the time. My home city is Cape Town, but I was unprepared. I think I was too emotionally distraught to just come back to Cape Town. Feeling the way that I did, and I decided to spend a few months in Durban, and it was a great location. I was by the seaside. It was an extremely, again, and the next phase, this was now my second trimester. I was by the seaside. I spent every morning and every evening just taking long walks by myself, speaking, to my Creator. Because again, it was quite an emotional time, but I had great people around me. I had very supportive friends at the time in Durban. And there I spent about 2.5 months, after which I finally decided that I needed to come back to Cape Town and be with my family. I arrived back in Cape Town. I was probably around 24 weeks. I started searching for, researching where I was going to give birth. Though from very early on, I had decided, I'd felt that I wanted it to be a home birth. Even before my divorce, I'd discussed with the father of my son that, it was going to be a home birth, and he actually laughed at me, thinking it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. We came from very, very different backgrounds. but yes, I knew from very early on that I wanted it to be a home birth, but having spent quite a bit of time out of South Africa, I was uncertain what the rules and regulations were pertaining to home births. Even though one of my sister-in-laws had at least two home births, one unassisted and one assisted. So, and later on, another sister-in-law who happens to be in New Zealand, she also had her most recent child at home, unassisted. Anyway, nonetheless, I eventually found a maternity home that I felt comfortable with. And also, something I forgot to mention from the get-go, the day that my birth date was, or my due date was plotted, I met a doula for the very first time, and this was in the UK. Prior to meeting her, in fact, it was the first time I'd ever heard the term doula. So it was something new to me, but something that I, geez, thanks. It was something new to me, but it appealed to every aspect of my belief system, and I decided from then that wherever I would be, I would definitely have a doula by my side. And strangely enough, in Durban, also, I just happened to meet one, very casually on one of my walks. So it just, she was a perfect stranger to me, and in fact she was from the States and she had married somebody in South Africa, so it was a very chance, I'd like to say chance, but very few things in life happens by chance, if any. Anyway, I found the maternity home and I was very comfortable with it, and the main midwife, or the head midwife at the maternity home, she introduced me to some of the staff members and took me on a little tour of the home, and I happened to explain to her the unusual circumstances. In fact, she asked me who would be present at my birth, and that led to me shedding some tears and explaining my situation to her. And she suggested a doula that was present at the home. From the get-go, I think our souls must have met in another lifetime, because we immediately clicked, and it was decided then and there. However, we'd manage it that she would be present, that she would be my doula. Shortly thereafter, I had to return to the maternity home for some basic checkups and tests and whatnot, and they discovered that my sugar levels were slightly impaired. At that point, I had gone for more, further tests, and it was felt that it was best that I be that they would pass my file on to a hospital rather than just a maternity home, because of the fact that they considered diabetes or gestational diabetes as high risk, even though mine was an intolerance more than actual diabetes. Anyway, I was then, this was at around 32 weeks, so it was quite late, I thought, into my pregnancy that I was moved from the home to the hospital. I had to go every week. I had to go for checkups, and each week there was an anomaly in the readings. One week I was asked. In fact, the readings were fairly okay, and they still felt that just because it was fairly, it was average, I think it was around 4 maybe, or close to 5, they still felt that I needed to continue at this particular hospital. The discussions that were had was that most likely at 36 weeks they would induce me. At that point, I thought I was still okay because it was a possibility. It wasn't really with certainty that they would do so. about the following week, a strange thing happened in that the nurses at the hospital, there was a certain procedure that was followed. You'd pass your urine, and then that would get tested, and then thereafter you waited for the doctors to see you, the resident doctors to see you. But that particular week, they just took the urine sample and didn't take, sorry, the normal procedure was after the urine sample, they would take the blood and then you'd see the doctor. But this particular week, after they tested the urine, they felt it was okay, and the nurse said it was unnecessary for my sugar to be, my blood to be tested, and that I could go, I should just go off and wait. Having done a fast, I was extremely famished. It could have been about 10 o'clock, so I hadn't eaten for 12 hours, and I went off and had myself something to eat. And thereafter, it came, when I got to see the doctor, he asked where my sugar readings were, and I said, well, they said it was unnecessary to take my blood. So I went off and had something to eat. The doctor then said, okay, well, now can you take your blood? But obviously I just had something to eat, so the sugar levels were quite high. But that was completely ignored, and from then, I was then passed on to a tertiary institute, a tertiary hospital. So even though I had explained quite clearly that, I think perhaps I should do another test or another fast, but the doctors that were present felt that, this was, even if I had eaten something, it shouldn't have been that high. Nonetheless, they passed me on to a tertiary hospital. By the following week, so already now I was, it was established at 32 weeks. I was already at 36 weeks when this happened, when they decided to pass me on to a tertiary hospital. There too, I had to go through similar tests. Eventually, they had decided that it wasn't just going to be an induction, that they would have a C-section. I would have a C-section because chances of baby being quite large was greater than it being normal, and the standard protocol was that beyond 4 kilos they could not deliver the baby normally, and it would be a C-section. That just completely sent me into orbit. I just thought, I plan to have a normal birth. I was meant to be checked in for what they call spreads, which is a sugar test that is done. And the night before I was supposed to have this test done, I had false labor pains, and it had me up all night, and I called them the next morning to say, look, I'm unable to make it. Could I do it on another day? They then booked me. It was a Thursday I was meant to go in, and then they booked me in for the following Tuesday, which was a clinic day. And I said, yeah, sure, that'll suit me just fine. My son decided to come the Monday morning before I was due to be booked in for spreads. And at about 1:30, I started having the severe pains. I kept crawling around for a good position. Decided to sit on a bouncy ball, and thought that might help, and then realized, oops, I think I wet the bouncy ball, and then I realized that my water had broken. I'd cleaned up, took a shower, called my sister-in-law who lived upstairs, and let her know that I was going into that labor. My water had broken, and labor should be soon. At that time, I was on WhatsApp with my sister-in-law in New Zealand, and she decided that she would be the one to count my contractions. So she called me, and she was on the phone with me, and we chatted. And every time I couldn't chat anymore, and then she said, "Right, okay, that's a contraction." And off I went and had my contractions. I think it was probably around 5 a.m. that I had that active labor kicked in, and about 2 hours later, two doulas arrived to assist me, and it was truly an amazingly beautiful experience having them by my side. My mum was there. Sorry, Mum, but I wanted as far as possible from me. But the doulas that were with me, they were fantastic. They kept offering me all sorts of things. It was a harrowing experience in that if I moved my pinky toe, I thought my body would split in half. That's how intense the pain was. And our neighborhood, that was my neighborhood for at least 30 years, they knew it also. I was unable to hold in the screams. I moved from the bedroom to the bath to the shower, and eventually I needed to poo. I desperately needed to go to the toilet, and I remember my doula saying, "But you can't. It's nearly time." And I said, "I need to go," and I went, and it was a movement. It wasn't, well, maybe I say it was a movement, but sitting there, my two doulas sat and watched me and said, "We can see the head. I think it's time for you to get off the toilet." At some point, one of the doulas, they were really fantastic. They just did everything that I needed them to do. They were quiet when they needed to be quiet. They were comforting when I needed them to be comforting. And at one point, one of them had asked me, what do I want? I said, "Please just make the pain stop. That would be great." And she said, she was really proud of me, and that I was her favorite client and all of that. And I said, if she really, really felt that way, she would make the pain stop. But nonetheless, she was unable to, but still. And then about 20 minutes, they had to pry me off the toilet because I couldn't get off. And eventually I found a position that was comfortable, and by this time my midwife had entered, and she heard the screams, and she just said with a very, very stern voice, "Malika, you need to calm down." And she came up right close to my ear and just said a few words to me. She just said, "Just breathe into where it's paining, and just 3 deep breaths, and my son just slid out." I mean, it was, in our antenatal classes, they spoke about the circle of fire. I don't remember that at all. I don't. He just slid out. They caught him and they slipped him under me, and there he is. I did a lotus birth, which I decided very spontaneously. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the lotus birth. I was reminded what it was, lying on my back, and I said, "Yes, sure, of course, anything spiritual at this moment would do me good." And yes, and we had a lotus birth, so for 4 or 5 days afterwards, I had my baby attached to the placenta. Until the cord dried up, and I got to cut the cord. It was quite an emotional experience, actually cutting the cord myself. And I had three fantastic women by my side. It was the loss of his father. Even after our separation, I had offered for him to be present at the birth, but sorry. The women that were present, I am most honored to have had them there, so that my son will know the strength of women.